I'm Mary Lyons, the Wealth Woman.
I'm Eric Alexander with Acorn Grove.
Welcome to the Wealth and Income Podcast.
I'm not excited about today's topic. Most of the time, I'm super excited. No, this is going to be a fun one. We were doing some data, we're doing some research, and we thought we'd bring it up. And we started looking at the impact of inflation, and then the change in income over time, and then change in the median house price over time. And it's been sort of a very fun conversation around the pressures that American families feel.
I
And
don't
and
think fun is the right description.
fun is in
Engaged,
like
engaged might be the right description.
interesting, engaged. Yes.
There you go. Yeah, I like that better.
But when we started to look through the data, it sort of gave a little bit of breadth and depth to some of the feelings that we've been having, some of the things that we've just sort of the pressures that we felt and some of the things that we've seen. And started looking through the data, and it's been really, really fascinating to see some of the changes. Um, and so we'll jump in a little bit, and there's going to be some charts on here. So for those of you listening in, we'll try to explain it. But one of the things we wanted to look at is something called M2 money supply, which is basically a measure of the number of dollars rolling around the economy. Mary, you and I have talked about this over the years, and your dad has been a big proponent of this measure. But give a little bit of an overview of what M2 money supply is and why that's important.
I don't want to. That's not fun.
I'm channeling your dad.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at what's happening, the Fed kind of determines how much liquidity there is in the economy as a whole. So they can increase rates or they can decrease interest rates to either suck money out of the economy, or they can just type some numbers into the computer and then there's more money flowing through the economy. And that really determines what, as consumers, we have access to.
Right. Yeah.
And that is a very oversimplified version there, but I think an easy to understand one at least.
Yeah. And I'll pull this chart up for those of you following along. And so basically all right, come on, pull it over. There you go. And so what we looked at, and so if you're seeing this on YouTube, you'll see this, or if you're seeing this on video, you'll see this. But when you look at the amount of dollars in the system, and I ran the data back from 1984 to basically 2022, just to give us kind of a nice 40-year run rate of what's going on in that period. And you'll see I'm not going to call it hockey stick, but it starts to look like a hockey stick pretty quick.
Wow.
Back in 1984, you're looking at 3 to 5 trillion. Is that trillions? I can't remember the unit of measure there, but it's quite a bit of money in the economy.
That's basically how much money is in circulation at that
Correct.
particular point in time.
Correct. And you'll see, and the interesting part is, call it $2.5 trillion of dollars floating around in the system in 1984. And by the time you got to 2001, so 15, 16 years at that point, that the number of dollars in the system grew, but it went from about 2.5 trillion to about 5 trillion. So that's a lot of money in the system, but it's a fairly flat curve. It's a fairly linear rise on that side of it. And then if you look at sort of 2001, really up till 2012, probably another 10, 11 years at that point, it went from 5 trillion to 10 trillion. And so we doubled again, went from 2.5 to 5, and then from 5 to 10 in a much shorter period of time.
Right. Right. And the thing that I think is interesting through all of this is that what you see, if you are following along with us, is that right about the time COVID hits in 2020, the slope goes from being relatively gradual to almost straight up and down. I mean, we jump from having about 15 trillion in circulation in 2020 up until, I mean, now we're at what, 22 trillion?
Yeah.
And 2022 is where this chart looks like it cuts off.
So 2 years.
Yeah, right. And so that is a huge jump in a 2-year time period. And when you include what's happened over the last 2 years, the numbers are even higher.
Yeah. And to the Fed's credit, as the interest rates have come up in 22 and 23, some of that is starting to pull back, but it's more of a flattening or more of a sort of a gradual increase versus a full pullback.
Right.
And they've got to be smart with it, because if they crank rates up to 17% in a matter of a couple months, markets have a
We end up,
tendency to collapse.
yeah, we end
Right.
up in an economic downturn real quick if something like that were to
Yeah.
happen.
But what I found fascinating on that side of it is when we started to look at the number of dollars in the system, one of the big things that come around every year is we got to pay for housing. Like, it, as one of our friends used to say, it costs money to park your butt indoors, right? We got to have a place to go, and indoor plumbing is pretty cool. And the thing that I found really, really fascinating was, one, the average price of a home in 1984 was about $95,000. And this is all inflation adjusted.
Mhm.
And if I look at that same house over the next 40 years, it's gone from about a $100,000 house, the median house price, to almost 500,000, 499,000 and change.
Mhm.
And that's insane. It's a 4x increase in about a 40-year period, which is really, really, really crazy.
Right.
And as somebody mentioned this morning in another call, it's like, well, that's great, because if I bought a house in the 90s, or if I bought a house in the 80s, that really worked out in my favor. I'm like, yeah, yes, it did. Your house was worth a lot more. But lest we forget, the only point in time where you get to realize the growth in that house is if you're homeless,
Right.
right? Because if you sell the house and make all that money, again, indoor plumbing is really cool. Air conditioning is really cool. You got to go buy another house somewhere, and now you're at the new price.
Right.
Um,
That's called trapped equity. It's the idea that, like, in your head, you think you have more money than you did before, but to maintain a house at the same level when you move, all that equity has to roll into the new house in order for you to maintain a similar lifestyle.
right. And the other interesting part of that curve, for those of you that can't see it, is in that 2020 range, as the number of dollars in the system skyrockets, so do the housing prices. So it's a very highly correlated measure of what the inflation is doing and how that actually responds, or how that relates to the house prices. But the part that I found in the next sort of picture of this, and the part that I found fairly interesting, is when I look at median income in the US versus the inflation, we're not quite keeping up, which I think is sort of the hard part of this chart.
Right. So if you look at what's happening as more and more money is going into the economy, which means someone has use of it. But when you take the median, not the average, but the median income, the picture that it paints is that most Americans are not actually getting a piece of those dollars. So if you've ever heard the idea that the middle class is shrinking, this is where some of that begins to come from. Because if you were to take the average income, because you would have the income from the people at the highest sort of offsetting income from people at the lowest, you would end up with a very different number than when you take the entire population and you just put a line in the middle and see where that puts us, right? And so
Right.
it gives a potentially more accurate reflection of what's happening in most households in the United States. And I
Right.
think this is particularly eye-opening because when you look at the fact that somebody has access to all of that money, and it may not actually be you in this circumstance, you have to realize that the cost of goods are going up pretty substantially because there is more money available in the economy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your lifestyle is getting better. And in fact, this chart would almost conclusively say it's the opposite.
Right. Well, and the next chart in that series is, if you look at sort of median house prices and median income, right? Median house price in 1984 was about 100 grand. I'm just going to round up to 100, and the median income is pretty close to 60.
Mhm.
So if I'm making 60 grand as a household and I'm buying a $100,000 house, the rule of thumb you and I have been using for years is your house should cost somewhere in the neighborhood of 1x to maybe 2x your income.
Yeah.
As far
And
as
you're
sort of
right
what,
there. I mean, it's if you're buying a $90,000 house and you're making $60,000, you're right at 1.5 times
right,
your income, right?
right,
And so just as a measure of debt to income ratio, I kind of did the math on this. If you're watching the video and you saw me looking down a couple of times, that's why, because I was doing some quick math. And if you look at the mortgage, just the principal and interest, on a $94,000 house, assuming a 7.5% interest rate, just so we keep things the same, looking at what it looked like then and what it looks like today as we're recording this. On a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, that would make your principal and interest payment about $657 a month. So $650. And then if we make the assumption that you're living in Texas, then you're probably paying about 2.5% in property taxes on top of that. So add another $200 a month to that payment. And then assuming that your homeowner's insurance costs about $50 a month in that environment, that puts your total monthly payment at about $907. So if you're making $60,000 a year, that's about 18% of your gross take home every single month. So if you think about debt to income ratios, that puts you in a place where less than 20% of your total income is going to housing, which means you have plenty of other money to do other things with.
Right. Right. Now, if we fast forward just a shade, the average house price in 2022, which is the last part where we had data for that, you're looking at about a $500,000 house. And the median income went from a whopping 60 grand to about 70, we'll call it 75.
Yeah. So I did the same math on this because I
Right.
thought it would be really interesting to see what that looks like. So if you're making $75,000 a year, that means that your take home pay, your gross take home, again, before taxes and all the rest of the stuff come out of your paycheck, but the gross monthly income is $6,550.
Right.
And if you look at what happens in that scenario, buying a $500,000 house, then you are now in the position where your principal and interest payment, assuming the same mortgage that you could have gotten in 100% financing. So I know it's not totally perfectly accurate, but just to give you the picture, is $3,500 a month. Plus, if you look at the taxes for property of that size in Texas, it's over $12,000 a year. So I just rounded down a little bit and said it was $1,000 a month. And then I said homeowners insurance would be about $250,000 a month. I'm sorry, $250 a month, not $250,000. And that's probably on the low side, honestly. Right. But if you look at that, that puts your monthly payment at $4,750. So if we look at that payment as a percentage of income, it's 72.5%. And that's before you've paid taxes.
Right.
And what that tells me is that the price of the median home does not match up with the price of the median income at this point in time, which means this sort of American dream that everybody can have a good lifestyle and live in a decent neighborhood and own a house may be in danger.
Well, I think, yeah, correct. And there's lots of houses that are less than 500 grand. Right. And that's why this is sort of the median bit of it, right? There's lots of houses that are way more than 500 grand. And so there are ways to go get some houses that are closer to what you could probably afford, but it's really hard to get it to that kind of 1.5x. Your salary part of it becomes a lot more challenging.
Right. And if you think about some of what's happening here, what this is also saying is that it's harder and harder to have a single income household. Because if the median income is 75,000 and you have two people working, now you have 150,000 of income throughout the year. And so if you look at the price of that same home and the percentage of your income going to it, it's closer to 35 to 37% of your total. So it's still doable, but not if you want to have a stay-at-home spouse who's raising your children. And I think we've seen that, right? More and more families are choosing to have both parents in the workforce just to be able to maintain a lifestyle. Whereas if you go back a generation or two, usually one parent stayed home and it was economically feasible for you to do that.
Right. Yeah. And so I think the other component of this, and I'm trying to sort of put a bow onto some of this, is I think there's a lot more pressure right now than there has been 20, 30, 40 years ago, and much more than that was probably 60 or 70 years ago on that side of it. Where the average job, to your point, and you had a stay-at-home spouse was a totally doable thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it is sort of the inflation component, but the other part of that I think is sort of the sneaky part of it is what I would call the technology inflation. And
Right.
if I look back to 84, because I was around at that time, like we had 5 or 6 channels. We were just starting to get introduced to like cable. Maybe we could get 7 channels or 10 channels.
Right.
But then we
Right.
were having to pay for it. We didn't have rabbit ears anymore. And I wasn't the remote control anymore. We actually had a button that we could go push instead of a kid that ran across the room to change the channels.
Well, and that's
Um,
about the time that you started seeing people purchasing PCs,
right?
personal
Yeah, Apple came
computers,
out with
their
84, right?
house. And so you start to see that. And so I think you're right. I mean, I always kind of jokingly say, if you think about what it was like for my grandfather and him planning for retirement, how was he supposed to know that he was going to need a new iPhone every couple of years because he didn't even have air conditioning when he was a kid? So you start looking at
Right.
that sort of rampant innovation and where we are right now, things become more expensive just because we want more creature comforts. And I think that to me, the point of this entire conversation is really about awareness, because
Yep.
when you start thinking about where we are right now and sort of the conventional planning methodologies, the focus is on accumulation only and rate of return, and trying to make sure the rate of return that you're earning in the market is beating the inflation rate so that you have a larger pile of money at some point in the future and you can take income from that. But the problem is that if you have inefficient distribution strategies and you end up cannibalizing your assets, each generation has to start over. And inflation becomes more and more difficult for you to manage the older you get, especially when you start depleting the assets that you have invested in the market during your retirement period.
Right.
And so to me, what this very, very clearly says is that we have to find better, more efficient ways to create more income safely so that people actually
Right.
can retire and maintain a lifestyle that they're excited about. But we also need to do it in a way that sets up the next generation so that about the time the next generation is getting to retirement and we are graduating from the planet at that point in time, there's something that we are leaving behind to that generation so that the people that come after us, our kids and our grandkids,
Yeah.
don't end up in poverty because they weren't able to amass great amount of wealth during their lifetime.
Yeah, and I think your idea about awareness is the right question, because if I know what the problems are, I know what to go do. But I think so much of it is we feel the pressure, but we can't quantify it, and we're
Right.
not sure of that next step. And I think it causes us to we've got to be more innovative and smarter and more efficient, and we've got to play offense and defense. Whereas before, I think most of our industry is spent dealing with offense. Just got to make more, got to earn more, better rates of return, less risk, all that stuff. And I think it calls us as an industry to do a better job at both the offensive part. How do we build? But how do we distribute? How do we manage cash flow? How do we make sure cash flow is moving through efficiently? Because we don't have as much of it.
Right. At an individual level, there is less that can be directed to savings if you want to maintain lifestyle. So
Right.
every dollar that you are able to save needs to be able to create efficiently income for the future.
Right.
And I think that's why we spend so much time talking about distribution strategies, because if you already have a growth strategy that you're excited about, it's not saying abandon that. It's saying
For
that
sure.
it needs to be partnered with a distribution strategy. And that strategy needs to be addressed long before you're ready to retire, because the sooner you implement distribution strategies, the more surety you have that you will be able to take a higher income level, and the more impressive the results. And I think that's such a key part of this, because if we just look at the information, we're like, gosh, that's scary. I hope things work out. They're probably not going to. But if we look at that information and now we know, hey, we need to ask different questions. We need to say, how am I going to be able to safely spend more of this in retirement? The more times we ask questions like that, the more pressure it puts on the financial services industry to develop and design solutions for you and your family. But if we don't start asking for those things, there's no pressure on the institutions to make change. So what you end up with
Yeah.
is maybe some advisors who feel very passionately about this, like we do, that are trying to start a grassroots movement for better planning. But at an institutional level, we have to remember that financial services institutions are going to do what creates profit. That's what their leaders are there for. It is a business. They are meant
Right.
to create profit. So if we don't demand that they do it in a way that is better for us, they're going to keep doing what's already working. And that may not be what is best for you or your family over
For sure.
time. Good doesn't mean it's great.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the enemy of the best is the good, or the enemy of the
What is
great.
the enemy of great? Yeah,
There
there
we
you
go.
go.
But
Yeah.
I think it also requires us to think through where we get our advice. I remember my Uncle Bob says that all you got to do is X, whatever X is, right? It's like, well, look, Uncle Bob
Uncle Bob had different problems.
had different problems, right? The context for which he was solving problems is completely different than your context. He probably had a pension, or he may have had a pension. His Social Security doesn't look as challenging as yours might look like. So I think the other component is not just asking better questions, but also looking at where the advice is coming from and understanding the context for which that advice is given. Because I think all advice is given in a meaningful way and meant to be helpful. But it could be dangerous if you don't understand the context.
Right. So I would say in terms of takeaways and priorities, the median income is going up, but not as fast as expenses are. And specifically, the cost of housing has risen astronomically, and our incomes haven't risen to keep pace with that, to stay in the same types of neighborhoods. And so what that means is if we have more money going to housing and less money going to saving and investing for the future, every dollar we do save needs to be that much more efficient, because we A, have less, and B, we know expenses are going to continue to increase over time. So we need our outputs to be better, and we need more certainty around those. As an added bonus, because we've talked about this before, if money works like a waterfall and income creation is our first priority, that means that income you don't need or spend flows into liquidity, and liquidity that you have eventually flows into legacy, which helps set up the next generation. So if we believe in the idea of leading by example, we have to take care of our house first and then teach the generations that come behind us how to adapt to these things. So if you don't know what you should be doing right now in order to deal with these issues, I'm going to give you a call to action. You need to immediately get onto social media, and you need to either DM Eric or you need to DM me.
Right.
Eric, where can they find you?
At Economics with Eric, wherever you use social media.
And if you're looking for me, you can find me at The Wealth Woman. We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Specific financial concepts and advanced strategies are presented to you for educational purposes only. We cannot and do not guarantee their applicability to your individual circumstance. We encourage you to seek personalized advice from qualified professionals on all financial matters.
Provided content is for overview and is not intended and should not be relied upon as individualized tax, legal, fiduciary, or investment advice. Neither Wealth Woman, Acorn Grove, or the Wealth and Income Podcast, nor their representatives provide tax or legal advice. For answers to specific questions and before making any decision, please consult a qualified attorney or tax advisors.
All numeric examples and any individual shown are hypothetical and were used for explanatory purposes only. Actual results may vary.
Investing involves risk, which includes potential loss of principal. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Guarantees are subject to the claims paying ability of the issuing insurance company.
Life insurance should be purchased by individuals that have a need to provide a death benefit to protect others with insurable interests in their lives against financial loss. Life insurance is not a retirement plan, investment, or savings account.
Not affiliated with or endorsed by the Social Security Administration, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or any governmental agency. Insurance and investment products, not a deposit, not FDIC or NCUA insured, not insured by any federal government agency, not guaranteed by any bank or credit union, may lose value.
Please visit the Wealth Woman website disclosure page for other important disclosures.